It's been called the worst persecution of Christians in the church's 2,000-year history, and it's happening right now across the Middle East. Join us today as we discuss the tragedy currently unfolding in the Middle East with special guest George Marlin, chairman of Aid to the Church in Need, USA, and author of the book Christian Persecutions in the Middle East, a 21st Century Tragedy. I'm Michael Hernon, Vice President of Advancement at Franciscan University in Steubenville, Ohio, and you're watching Franciscan University Presents. Stay with us. Welcome to Franciscan University Presents. Today we'll be talking about the persecution of Christians in the Middle East. I'm your host, Michael Hernon, Vice President of Advancement here at Franciscan University in Steubenville, Ohio. I'm joined in our studios with our regular panelists, Dr. Regis Martin, Professor of Systematic Theology here at the university, and Dr. Scott Hahn, who holds the Father Michael Scanlon Chair in Biblical Theology and the New Evangelization, again here at Franciscan University. And we're pleased to welcome George Marlin. George is the chairman of the Aid to the Church in the USA, Aid to the Church in Need USA. You've had a long-time career in public life, in the executive director and CEO of the Port Authority in New York. You've been a investment banker. You're a prolific author, writing for dozens of publications, New York Times, Washington Post, and the rest. You're the author of 11 different books, including The American Catholic Voter, The Quotable Chesterton, which is wonderful, and the book we'll be discussing today, The Christian Persecutions in the Middle East, a 21st Century Tragedy. So thank you and welcome to the program.
Well, thanks for having me.
So we're going to be talking about the persecution of Christians in the Middle East. So there's a lot to cover here, but I think it's important to kind of set the stage and the context for us before we go deeper into the persecutions. Is there a place in the world with richer Christian heritage than the Middle East? So we're talking about the Middle East, so let's start there.
Well, I think it's fair to say there is no richer place. You know, it's interesting. I spent 17 years in the Catholic educational system and undergraduate degree in political science and Thomistic philosophy, but again, that education was very European-centric.
Yes.
And we forget that the church originated, really, the first headquarters of the church before Rome was Syria. And about a year and a half ago, we had as a guest here in the United States, Aid to the Church in Need hosted the Melkite Archbishop Metropolitan of Aleppo. And we did various television shows. We had them through Boston, New York, and Washington. But one day we were having lunch with Cardinal Dolan of New York, and he and the Archbishop Jean Bart of Aleppo were going to do a serious radio show, television show afterwards. So as we were waiting in the anteroom to have lunch with the Cardinal, Archbishop Jean Bart got a call from Aleppo being told that his residence, his cathedral, and his office administration building were bombed again. And again, this was a year and a half ago, and we know it's gotten a lot worse since then. But during lunch, this came up as a topic of discussion. And he looked at us and said, "Let me remind you, I walk in the footsteps of the apostles. I walk in the footsteps of St. Peter. I am 76 years old. I am not going to leave Aleppo. I will die in Aleppo." And so it struck me then that, yes, there was the first headquarters of the church in Syria. The term Christian and Christianity was coined in Syria. So yes, we have the Church of the Martyrs there. We have 2,000 years of history there. So indeed, that area in the Middle East as a whole was really the origins of the church. It was the church.
It was the birthplace of Christianity.
Church.
And when you think about, sorry, go ahead.
No, just an extraordinary man. The story that you've recounted. I mean, Aleppo, the most dangerous place on the planet. It's ground zero in this war on terror, and we're losing it. And yet there's the matrix where Christianity first emerged. Yeah. We've come full circle.
Absolutely.
Astonishing.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And if you think about the Middle East, I do think that at least Catholics in America and the Western world often think of the Christianity of the Middle Ages, of the high forms of the church, and we do forget where our birth was from. What happened in the 7th century that changed the Middle East?
Well, that's the interesting thing. People forget that we've been there for 2,000 years. We were there long before the Muslims arrived on the scene. So I think, to put it in a historical nutshell, with the rise of Islam, particularly shortly after the death of Muhammad, the founder, you had religious wars going on. Yeah. And so in the early days, in 6th, 7th, 8th century, the Muslims began to conquer the Middle East because the old Persian and Byzantine empires were beginning to collapse. They were fighting, and they were at one of those throats for centuries. You had the various schisms within the Catholic Church, so the Eastern rites came about, and over disagreements of, a sentence here and a half phrase there. It's when you look at the history of that, you say, how did that happen? But it did happen. So you had this chaos. So the Muslims began to conquer the Middle East, but the Christians were still a vast majority. So even though there were jihads, and even though there were, putting the Crusades aside for the moment, there were accommodations like anything else.
Yes.
And so when the Christians were majority, they sort of lived side by side. As the Muslims became the majority, there was, the Christians were second-rate citizens,
sure,
had to pay taxes. In some areas they weren't allowed to own a horse, because if you have a horse, you can be dangerous.
Of course.
Battle. But Christians also provided, they tended to be the better educated. They provided a lot of services, but more important, as trading began with Europe, they were sort of the conduit between Christian Europe and Muslim Middle East. So there were accommodations. It was not a perfect world, but they were sort of, for the most part, left alone, even though they were second-class citizens. They were considered, as Muhammad said, members of the book, meaning the Bible they accepted, but that was not the final word, and the Quran was the final word, so they were imperfect. But they respected Christ, they respected Jews, but said they're imperfect, so we charge them a tax for being second-rate
Well, not
citizens.
just a tax, but a punitive,
punitive tax. Yes. Okay.
Not that they would charge us for other.
Jews and Christians, as people of the book, it wasn't as though they accepted the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. Yeah. They saw those as corrupted. So it wasn't incomplete. Simply that Muhammad was the last prophet whose revelation was definitive. Is that the message of Jesus being divine was wrong, being the Son of God was wrong, being crucified was wrong. So the Injil, the gospel, was itself completely perverted early. And
sure.
So, it's one of those things where they emphasize the respect that they have shown to the people of the book. But if that's respect, don't show me disrespect.
Yeah. So when Christianity was in majority, they were able to coexist.
They ran the government, they ran the place, but when you're in the minority and the majority, you got to accommodate for a while.
That's right.
So you become the majority.
Right. But through diplomacy and charity, they were able to navigate.
But
in the practical,
charity.
To live is to maneuver, as Whittaker Chambers famously said, and in the practical order, people make adjustments, accommodations, but implicit in the religion of Islam is a foreign policy basically fiercely hostile to everything Christian. They are determined to wipe us out. And so we shouldn't be surprised at what's happening in the Middle East, this tragic denouement. This is what the Arab Spring was all about, finally.
When you think about it, so just taking us back from the 7th century when some trouble began brewing in the Middle East for Christians. Fast forward to today.
Well, we should touch on the Crusades for 2 seconds, okay. I think, because
at least,
as you may recall, President Obama at the National Prayer Service was about a year or so ago, and he said, well, we Christians who think we're holier than thou, remember the Crusades when we went in there and murdered a lot of people, all this stuff. But when I wrote my book, I had went back and reread a lot of Bernard Lewis, who I think we agree is the leading expert, who turned 100 not too long ago, and I gather is still kicking and has all his marbles. But he wrote about the Crusades, quote, "They were a long-delayed Christian response to the jihad, an attempt to recover by holy war what had been lost by holy war."
Yeah.
Now that's Bernard Lewis, quote unquote. So yes, I will agree that when you have hand-to-hand combat of Christians versus Muslims at that time, it was pretty brutal.
Right.
And war like that was brutal. But then again, if you're on the receiving end of a drone bomb, that's pretty brutal too.
Yeah.
You know, there's something, there's a total eclipse of the truth here with regard to the Crusades, largely due to the brilliant writing of Professor Runciman, who back in the 50s had this multi-volume set come out on the Crusades. Now, if it had been published
There's a very
as
fancy
fiction,
edition from the Folio press that still is out there.
I have that too. If it had been published as fiction, it would have been marvelous. But to call that history, you know, is borderline farcical, but because his writing style is so brilliant, it was so effective at completely converting at least one, probably two generations of historians now to see the Crusades as a massive injustice that we should never stop apologizing for, when in fact it was a just war, at least, if not a holy war.
That's right.
And a war of defense, a war of reclamation, of hundreds of thousands of Christian women and children and men who had been enslaved. And slaughtered and this sort of thing. And so, you know, I know we have to proceed delicately, but I hope we proceed forthwith to really recover what the truth is.
What truth?
Yes.
What books would you recommend on the Crusades?
We did a whole show actually on the Crusades.
Well, you know, we just lost one of the greatest Catholic historians of the Crusades, Jonathan Riley Smith.
Okay.
But anything that Jonathan Riley Smith has written is good. Thomas Madden at St. Louis is also.
Thomas Madden also? Okay, because Ignatius republished one of Riley's books.
Right, right. Yeah,
well, we live in very strange times, because on the one hand we have militant Islam on the march, this appetite for conquest, this juggernaut which doesn't appear to be stoppable. But on the other hand, we've got a lot of self-hating Christians who make constant excuses for the so-called excesses of the Crusades.
Well,
we've got to overcome that false dialectic.
Again, going back to Bernard Lewis, his argument was that when the British and the French were trustees, so to speak, after the First World War, as opposed to the British in India, where they had control and created an administrative state and created a government that could be adaptable. And why India worked, as trustees, they didn't do any of that. And so he would argue that when we pulled out, or the French and the English pulled out after the Second World War, there was nothing left of a structure there, and that sort of asked for trouble. And we've seen this brewing for the past 40 or 50 years. But you know, you're right. Now we have the militants taking over, be it the Muslim Brothers, the Al Qaeda, now the ISIS. This sort of militantism, to me, is very different than what we. Secretary of State Kerry made a point a year or so ago, saying, "Well, people like ISIS, people just don't operate like that in the 21st century." Like, I don't know what the Obama and Kerry, this is the 21st century. You know, what does that mean? I don't know. But having said that, he said, people don't act the way they did in the 19th century. And I first said, no, not the 19th century, Mr. Secretary. They're acting like they did in the 7th and 8th century. But then when you think about 7th and 8th century, it's not as bad as what they're doing today, because they really want to wipe Christianity off the face of the earth in the Middle East. So you're right, this militantism is very different from what Christians have experienced in the Middle East over thousands.
You know, you also touched on these were the remarks that you made last night that were very moving. But you touched on the forgetfulness of history, and you made the point about the genocide of the Armenians, and you quoted Hitler, who said, you know, people have already forgotten about that, so we can proceed with impunity against Jews. And in fact, we have forgotten. It's just not on the radar. So how do you revive that memory?
What is more amazing is that the Turkish government, if anyone dares to refer to that as a genocide, as you all know, when Pope Francis condemned the genocide, they yanked out the ambassador from the Turkish ambassador to the Vatican. But even in the United States, where there have been measures in Congress to try to condemn it as genocide, and I was told by the Armenian ambassador to the Vatican that President Obama had promised to condemn the genocide, and he and the ambassador, Armenians, you know, have a short fuse, and this guy was an angry man, that the White House did not do that during 2015. So even in the United States, our national government is afraid to refer to that as genocide. I don't get it, you know, but in Turkey, if you dare speak out, it's over.
Well, there is a certain,
never seen again.
There is a certain sense in which genocide is the most appropriate term because of its connotation and its linkage to Hitler and the final solution against the Jews that he concocted. On the other hand, not to defend their perspective, but in a certain sense, it's not really targeting Armenians because they're Armenians. It was targeting Armenians because they were Christians.
Yes.
And so, strictly speaking, it wasn't genocide so much as the very onset, the reintroduction of jihad.
Well, within the definition of the UN conventions of genocide,
That's
they
right.
mention
It's a race.
religious, sex, race, and religion if you are sought out psychologically, murdered, etc. So under the UN, it is genocide by their own definition.
And so when we looking forward, we've got ISIS, we have the Muslim Brotherhood, we have this radical rise. I mean, they have so much today that is confronting Christians in the Middle East. It's actually unbelievable, and it's still not being called what it truly is.
Well, if you remember, and the picture on the cover of the book of the ISIS chopping off the heads of the Coptic Christian, when Josh Earnest, the president's spokesman of the White House, was asked about this, he said the following: "We are sorry that those Egyptian citizens were murdered." Now, they were Egyptian citizens. They were not murdered because they were Egyptian citizens. They were murdered because they were Egyptian Christians. So they couldn't bring themselves for that word to pop out of their mouth.
Yeah.
And it refers to what you sort of, they're saying, the Armenians. Well, that was,
Forgetting it.
This is right out of Orwell. Doublespeak.
We have so much more to get to. Stay with us for the next segment of Franciscan University Presents.
Within Islam today, there are two really varied interpretations of Christianity. The more moderate voice, which is in some ways the majority voice, focuses on the common intellectual heritage, on biblical figures, and even on Jesus and Mary and their importance of faith today. The more radical interpretation, though, focuses on the parts of the Quran that talk about the use of violence to expand the religion, focuses on the life of Muhammad, who actually used violence himself, leading raids on opposing communities as a way of expanding the faith. But we can base our ties on the more moderate interpretation of Islam and the common heritage of acknowledging Jesus. And moderates will join with us in accepting his importance as a prophetic figure, as a miracle worker. But the radicals will always disagree with us fundamentally and see us as heretical because of our interpretation of him having a divine nature.
People recognize Franciscan University as being academically excellent and passionately Catholic. We have the unique opportunity through our faculty members, through our students, to proclaim that academic excellence by reaching out in many different ways. We also remain passionately Catholic in the way in which we are able to worship, the way in which we are able to bring that love of Christ to others on a daily basis. It's important for us to be able to embrace both.
Welcome back to Franciscan University Presents. We've been talking about the persecution of Christians in the Middle East. We're joined by our special guest, George Marlin, who's the author of this book, Christian Persecutions in the Middle East, a 21st Century Tragedy. George, we have kind of set the historical context of where we've been, the reality of genocide and the targeting of Christians and how they're being driven out of the Middle East. We left the last segment talking about ISIS, or beginning to talk about ISIS, and even their imitators or other collaborators. Where are they having the most success? Where are they having the greatest impact in the Middle East?
Well, obviously in Syria and Iraq in particular, but I think some setting. As I mentioned earlier, when the British and French pulled out, there was not states, viable states.
Right.
Now, theoretically, we could say viable states evolved over time, but this Wilsonian view of foreign policy that we are to bring democracy and that saves the world, what we've learned is that you can have an election and you can elect illiberals to run a government. And that's exactly what we saw in the aftermath of the Arab Spring. But in addition to the chaos by the United States completely pulling out of Iraq, it brought to a rise of an offshoot of al-Qaeda, which is more radical than al-Qaeda, and al-Qaeda is pretty radical to start off with, ISIS, who declared a caliphate and just started conquering lands. And what we've seen is, even though there are now battles and they may be losing a great deal of their property at this point in time, it's what they've left in the mess, particularly in Syria. You have a civil war. Nobody knows exactly who the good guys are, except to me, on the Muslim side, even though they're battling Assad and there's all sorts of factions and groups going, ISIS grows out of this, who was caught in the middle of the Christians.
Yeah.
Now, the Christians were viewed, particularly in the better part of the 20th century, in the post-World War II era, as sort of agents of the West. They were the most educated. And keep in mind, throughout the Middle East, particularly in Syria and Iraq and even in Egypt, most of the orphanages, most of the hospitals, most of the social services are run by Christians. These Christians, many are educated in Europe. They're well educated. They had publishing houses. They ran newspapers. And again, there was these sort of uneasy accommodations, but they introduced a lot of social services to the Middle East. But they were viewed as agents of the West because, we think of the West as Christianity, of Christendom,
right.
and many of them are educated in Europe. So they were looked upon with suspicion. So when you have all these outbreaks, they're caught in the middle as the bad guys.
Right.
So we have ISIS, who is not only gaining great tracts of land, but their intent in wiping out the face of Christianity from the Middle East. Now, a couple of things which your listeners should know is that, we know that there's close to 500,000 people have been killed there so far. We know that 10 million people have lost their homes, but what a lot of people may not know is that 2.4 million children, many of them Christians, can't go to school anymore. There's over 15,000 children that have been murdered in the Civil War. Right. Over 600 medical people have been killed, doctors, nurses, nuns in the medical services. 83% of the electrical grids don't work, so they're literally living in the dark. 1.2 million people have settled in Lebanon. Lebanon's population has gone up by 50%, basically refugees. 1.6 million have settled in Turkey. Genocide is beginning committed against Christians, even in the United States. On a quiet afternoon, Kerry came out and said, yes, there's genocide in the Middle East, thank you, and they ran off to the side. And what we don't hear about also, and what's happening with ISIS, is they are taking Christian girls, kidnapping them, raping them, murdering them, selling them into slavery, forcing them to convert and marry ISIS members. This is happening to tens of thousands of Christian girls. Where's the outrage? Where's the feminists? Where's the ranting and raving? Where's the banging of the pots and pans? Nothing in the West. So this is the kind of stuff you never hear of. You don't read about in the New York Times, sad to say. So the Christians have been caught in the middle, and when you sit down and meet many of the, as I've had opportunities to meet many of the Syrian bishops in particular, and some of the Iraq bishops, these are the stories they tell you. And what I try to do in this book is, we have at Aid of the Church Need, we do a lot of work there, but we also have people on the ground and they're reporting stuff to us. Yeah. I know this book came out last year, so it's already dated in the sense of, but there's horror stories of the first 15 years of the 21st century. And obviously the horror stories have continued since then. Right. So this is for whatever reasons, the West just doesn't want to talk about. Yeah. So we try to get these stories out there, particularly to let people know in the Christian world, the Western world, what's going on and what we can do to help them. Yeah. So these are the unknown stories, and there's so many unsung heroes and so many martyrs in the Middle East, but sad to say, the West has had its head in the sand, doesn't want to talk about it.
Well, it's inconvenient, it's uncomfortable, but it still defies logic why we haven't heard all these stories.
I hope it's not across the board. I mean, we're familiar with the phenomenon of selective indignation, and it does apply with a broad brush to the liberal mindset. I mean, that's the zeitgeist, the spirit of the age. It's steeped in secularism and a kind of historical forgetfulness. But what about Catholics? I mean, you must be talking to lots of bishops. Can they be mobilized?
Yeah, well, yeah. A lot's being done. One thing I should point out is the UN will say, well, we are doing great humanitarian aid and supplying humanitarian aid to the refugee camps in Syria and Iraq. The problem is there are no Christians in those refugee camps, because Christians are afraid to go there because they're afraid they'll be beat up or murdered by Muslims. So it's been the institutional church that has had to provide on the Catholic end, Aid of the Church in Need, Catholic Near East, the Knights of Columbus and other groups have been supplying directly by way of the institutional church all sorts of humanitarian aid, et cetera. Now, we can get into that in a little bit. But again, we've been doing our work with the Catholic Church. Others have been doing it with the church. Cardinal Dolan, we had one of the patriarchs was over from the Middle East in June, and Cardinal Dolan had a dinner at his residence, and I was happy to be invited. When I came in, he had been to the Middle East a month or so earlier, and he said, I couldn't believe all the ACN signs wherever I went, and all these camps and all these Christian refugee camps. So Christians are going to the churches. The churches are packed, people sleeping in there. We've tried, and others have sent the money to set up, Quonset huts, to set up schools, to set up medical facilities, to give humanitarian basic staples, to bring in any counseling help they can bring, to finance medical service, etc. So the institutional church is doing that separately because they're not getting the UN aid.
Right.
So when you say, I happen to agree with you, we should be beating the pots and pans a lot more to get this message out. But if it were not for the church and various church organizations, it would be far worse. It's not enough, it's far from enough, it's not talked about enough. And we try to get these stories out. If you go to our website, you'll see every time we get new information, we put it up there because no one believes what's going on.
No, it really is unbelievable. And it's selective indignation. But, to think or to say that Islamophobia is the primary problem is selective blindness. There's a Christophobia that is pervasive in our own culture, where there's a fear of Christianity being brought up as though, we're going to privilege this religion that we have discarded. I was just recently with the Chaldean Rite Bishop Francis up in Michigan, and we were talking at some length about the situation, the plight. And he had to be very cautious. I mean, he's outspoken, he's clear-headed, he's profound, he's really connected to the people, but he also pointed out that there's a certain degree of prudence because there are a lot of people left behind still in Iraq. I mean, not many. I mean, we're not talking hundreds of thousands, we're talking about thousands or at the most tens of thousands, but anything that is publicly heard or said, is going to rend back. They're going to be vulnerable.
Yeah.
And Mosul and other cities, but especially Mosul, it's just been wiped out. I mean, this was a kind of a bastion of Catholic Christian civilization and culture going back nearly 2,000 years. And we don't know for sure if there's any Christian presence left there. No churches, monasteries, schools, hospitals.
No, the bishop, I forget what rite, but Bishop Nooner, I think his name was, announced, I have no diocese. There's nobody left in my diocese.
Right.
So they've destroyed every church. There is not a Christian left.
Right. Yeah.
It's over.
Yeah.
And Archbishop John Bart of Aleppo, we raised this money for him. What he's wanted to do, we had a good trip. We raised about $1 million for him. We put in money, KSC, and then the various communities, Syrian community, helped out. But his objective for this money was to try to get people to stay or come back. If you're a carpenter, I'll give you money to buy your tools. If you're a dentist, I'll give you money to buy your dentist chair or your medical facility. He is trying to bring them back, because the great fear is no one will ever go back and there'll be nothing there.
That's unbelievable.
This is incomprehensible, really. What was the point of the intervention into Iraq? Just to topple Saddam Hussein, who at least allowed the Christians to thrive. He wasn't killing them.
Well, he left them alone, and even Assad in Syria, the Syrian priests will argue, he left us alone.
It was tolerance, at least, on some level.
When you have a secular Sunni dictator who has in Iraq, like Hussein did, a minority of Sunnis who, in a sense, ruled the Shiites and allowed Christianity to flourish, and even had a Catholic in his cabinet, to go in and to wipe that out and to create a vacuum that ISIS basically fills. The only explanation is the oil fields.
Yeah.
But it's such a short-sighted thing that we're blind to Christian history.
If we look at the tragedy that's happening to the Christians themselves, we also just recognize the historical significance of what's being stamped out. What is happening to the Christian patrimony that we have, the art, the architecture, the artifacts?
What is different than any other time in history is that ISIS is looking to destroy the institutional church, the cathedrals, the churches, the ancient monasteries, the ancient sites. The tomb of Jonah was destroyed, the ancient documents, all of that's being destroyed. And so they are wiping out any trace of Christianity. So that's the other part of the madness that's going on there. And once again, there is no outrage. Now, if you remember, when our invading forces conquered Iraq, there was a great fuss in the press because some of the citizenry went to rioting and destroyed a couple of museums and this and that. You thought the end of the world was coming. They were blaming us, like, why aren't you controlling us? Yeah. You're allowed to raise an eyebrow on that and say, why aren't you controlling that? But troops come in, fine, they took care of it. But you've heard nothing about that.
Right. Yeah.
With the destruction of the Christian sites, Christian relics, Christian cathedrals, etc.
It's one thing to expel the Christians. They take flight out of fear, and then Christianity becomes a kind of museum piece. But this is worse.
Oh, Paul
it's been reduced to
Paul
a
VI
heap of
called
ruins.
it the Church of Stones.
Yeah, and the stones are scattered.
It's going to be a church of rubble before
nothing left.
But it's worth noting, again, when I came across it when I was doing research for this book, even during the American occupation, several thousand Christians were murdered. The Muslims are most suspicious because they always thought they were agents of the West to start off with.
Right.
So if the American troops, the American occupying force, hired Iraqi Christians to work, do whatever work, they were generally, their homes were destroyed, they could be murdered, their hands could be chopped off. If American soldiers went to a Christian store or restaurant or something, they'd come at night, destroy the restaurant, chop off the hands of many of the Christians, or just gouge out their eyes, or just blow them away. So even during our occupation, thousands of Christians were murdered. In addition to that, the Constitution was skewed against Christians, and no one sort of thought this out.
Right. Yeah,
and so there was there were free elections, but Christians ran, but there were a very tiny minority were elected some legislative posts, and then the second elections, they were pretty much wiped out in terms of the election. So it was skewed towards the Muslims, so the Christians were basically locked out. So there was no thought process on our side to protect the Christian minority or other minorities in Iraq, so it sort of got lost. And now with the void of us leaving, it was even tougher on the Christians, because now you could say, by the way, you were agents of the West, they're gone now, so we're going to go after you. So, scores of churches, monasteries also in Iraq have been destroyed. And always when you look at it, even before, if you look even from 2000 to 2011, as I do in the book, always around Easter, Christmas. It could be Egypt, it could be Iran, it could be Iraq, it could be Egypt, Syria. Churches get bombed, always around Christmas and Easter.
Yeah. Stay with us for the next segment of Franciscan University Presents.
So Christian persecution does not only take place in the form that we are observing in the Middle East. Christian persecution can also be quite subtle. It generally tends to take place in countries that have embraced socialism. I experienced this directly in the island of Malta in the late 70s, early 80s, where the government, the socialist government, was attacking the church directly in a country that prides itself in being 95 to 98% Catholic. From my observations, what I see is that this kind of persecution tends to take place in places where people embrace egoism, where people have an apathy towards their faith, and also where people have a significant misunderstanding of the true meaning of freedom as well as the role of the government.
I'm a communication arts major, the president of Film Club, and an editor for Franciscan University Presents. It's really great to be able to work on Franciscan University Presents because it is a national television show on EWTN, and in a lot of other schools you're not going to have that kind of ability to put that on a resume. When I graduate, I know that I'm going to be firm in sticking with my faith and going to daily mass and a frequent confession and things like that, because instead of just learning with my mind or just focusing on schoolwork, I actually can grow with my whole person. Franciscan University is academically excellent and passionately Catholic.
Welcome back to Franciscan University Presents. This entire program springs forth from the very heart of Franciscan University in Steubenville, Ohio. Our students are operating the cameras and equipment. They're in the control rooms. This is in the communication arts studio here on campus, and our regular panelists are theology professors here at Franciscan University. George, we've been obviously going through a substantial amount of what I would say is very tragic and dire news about our brothers and sisters in the Middle East, their persecution, their torture, their exile, and the very birthplace of Christianity is being stomped out in a lot of ways. Why is it important, why is it essential for the Middle East that the Christian community survives?
Well, in the age of diversity, to have some diversity in the Middle East, I suppose, wouldn't be a bad thing. In addition to that, Christianity has historically provided a great deal of the social services that otherwise did not exist in the Middle East.
Yes.
So those are important. But then there is a broader question here of, it was the birth of Christianity. We've been there for 2,000 years. It's interesting in Lebanon, where you have Christians versus Hamas. And Hamas and Christians are sort of battling together, going after ISIS when they try to sneak over the border a bit. But the claim is, this is our historical lands. Our family, we could trace generations of families going back 1,000, 2,000 years, and you know, we have as much right to be here as Islam has to be here. So that's the historical perspective, I think. All right.
Well, more right, actually, because we were there first.
Yeah, we were there first.
But also, I mean, there is something about Christianity that provides openness for the other, a certain tolerance, respect for the dignity of other people, even people that you violently disagree with. You're not going to cut their heads off. You might preach to them, maybe quote John 6 about the bread of life, but you're not going to shoot them. Unlike the antithesis, Islam, which is bent on complete destruction of the other. So Christians have got to be restored to the Middle East if you want anything viable to survive.
But I think we have to see the need to develop a realistic approach that isn't just simply saying, look, our secular pluralistic toleration is a better program, because they would see that as an alien value. That is exactly what we call Western decadence. And I think what we have to recognize is that religion has a capacity to form a civilization. We don't recognize that in our secularized post-Christian West. They see that. Historians will show that. So we have to approach this not only as Americans who want to emphasize the need for toleration, but as Christians who recognize the need for prayer and for devotion. And we have a lot to learn from the way Muslims take their faith so seriously. I must admit, I really enjoyed this book. And the facts, the statistics. But my favorite part is actually chapter 11, the round table, where you have 2 archbishops and 2 bishops and 2 priests, all of whom are indigenous voices, who know this from Egypt or from Syria and Iraq and so on. And to hear them describe the problem, I mean, they are exerting themselves in terms of diplomatic self-restraint. And yet at the same time, one of them says there is no moderate Islam. There's Islam, there's Christianity, and there's Judaism. And I know what he was trying to say, that Islam's founder, Muhammad, was a great warrior. Within 8 years after his death, there were 50 or 60 battles that conquered entire people groups and that kind of thing. But I think we have to recognize from the long haul, we have to look at this as Christians and say, we have short-term solutions as Americans in the West, but as Christians, we've got to go there and shore up the Christian communities that are still there and do everything we can. And I know that Aid in the Church in Need is in existence for that purpose. And so, I just want to thank you for that, but also encourage our listeners or our viewers to back this sort of effort.
I mean, it was a simple little thing, but just we need to recognize that the birthplace of Christianity is under threat right now, and that affects not only the people there, but Christianity, I believe, is thoroughly under assault right now. And as Christians, we need to recognize.
I would place this on the plane of metaphysics. Certainly in the moral order, Christianity represents tolerance, forbearance, openness to the other. But at the level of epistemology, Christianity represents truth and the capacity of man under the impetus of grace to know the truth, to apprehend the truth, to understand it. God is truth, logos. And with Islam, you have the triumph of the will, an arbitrary will, a hateful will. It wrenches ethos out of logos. Reason and revelation do not stand together. They're not harmonized. And that wrenching, that dislocation has proven to be a disaster for great numbers of people. We're paying the price for those errors.
There is, again, in that chapter 11 roundtable discussion, a lot of good conversation that I found evocative, insightful. Because Judaism is a religion of holiness, of law, of wisdom. Christianity is a religion that fulfills that in terms of love, in terms of divine truth, the mystery of the Trinity revealed in the sacrifice of Jesus. But when you hear Allahu Akbar, it's not just simply God is great. When you look at it grammatically, what they're really saying is God is greater, Allah is greater, because Islam is a religion of power. And this is what you were just pointing to. It might seem like a religion of hatred from our perspective, but it's power. What is the greatest thing about God? Is it love or is it power?
Right.
And the superiority of Muslims, of Islam, of Allah, is exhibited precisely in terms of power.
Yeah.
And so this is why there are deaths, this is why there is destruction, because it is a religion that celebrates the will of Allah exhibited in terms of a superior power. Until we really allow this uncomfortable truth to sink in, dialogue is going to remain superficial.
And if that's the case, then the relationship you have to Allah is one of submission, servitude. Whereas in the Christian dispensation, it's a relationship of love, friendship, intimacy. I mean, God wants to endear himself to us.
So when we think about on the ground in the Middle East, what is the West doing, good, bad, to change the situation on the ground in the Middle East?
Well, as I said earlier, the West appears to have its head in the sand.
Yes.
There are the immediate problems. As I mentioned last night, one of the Syrian bishops came to see us in Brooklyn a couple of years ago, and he told us the horror stories. Now, this was about 3 years ago, so it was not as bad as it is today. It was bad, but gotten worse, let us say. But at the time I said to him, if you had a wish list, what's on top of your wish list right this moment? What do you need? What can we do for you? And he looked at me and said, I need a cheese-making machine. And I was like, huh? And a generator to go with. I said, I don't get it. A wish list this. Well, he said to me, my flock is fleeing to Lebanon. Many can't get into Lebanon. There are mountains between Lebanon and Syria. They are living off the land in these mountains. It's winter. They have goats. We got to make cheese. It cost like 25 grand for the cheese-making machine. We got that for him, the generator, etc. But the point is, this is the immediate need.
Survival.
Survival.
Yeah,
that's right.
And this is where the shepherds are. They're in the midst of their flock there.
And that's where they're supposed to be. And as the Archbishop Jean Bart said, I will die here. I will be here as a shepherd. So now Aid of the Church in Need and other organizations, what we're providing, and if you go to the website of Aid of the Church in acnusa.org, you'll see stories and things of what's there. But so we provide monthly food ration supplies. We supply fuel to shelter them, to warm them. We supported bringing counseling to help those who have suffered from trauma. We assist families to vaccinate their children, paying for these medical services. We meet the basic food needs. We've set up Quonset huts and other things, which for schools for these kids, for medical facilities for these kids and their families. So, it's the church that's doing this, and these are the immediate needs. Then we have the West appeasing Islam, which is part of the major problem. As we look at what happened in France, it's amazing if you remember when, I think it's Charles Krauthammer who says that when somebody makes a faux pas in Washington, it means they're really telling the truth. Got caught telling the truth. If you remember, Secretary of State Kerry condemned the attack on the dance hall in France at that time, but said, well, when it came to that newspaper, one might understand, and he got caught in saying one might understand why the Muslim react, because they did crazy cartoons. He had to take that back. But that's the mindset.
Right.
Now, the New York Times refused to publish those cartoons, saying it would offend our Muslim readers in Brooklyn. First of all, the New York Times guys couldn't find Brooklyn if their life depended on it. Right. And secondly, they don't know any Muslims in Brooklyn. But when there was this ugly caricature of Pope Benedict that came out shortly thereafter, they published it. And my reaction was, well, what about the Catholic readers in Brooklyn who might be offended? Right. That does not enter the conversation. It's not on their radar. It's not on their radar. Yeah. So this appeasement, I don't know. I don't quite get it. Is it fear? Because Arthur Schlesinger Sr. said the last acceptable prejudice is anti-Catholicism. They're not afraid of us because we don't blow them up or throw bombs or shoot them on the street or kill their families. So is it out of fear? Otherwise, if it's not fear, I don't quite understand what it is, that these people want to look the other way and rationalize everything that's going on. I don't get it.
That is the troubling part. We don't.
You guys have any ideas? Because I don't, all right? I've been watching this for years and just can't figure it out.
Yeah. Well, Chesterton has a great quip about people not knowing what they're doing because they don't know what they're undoing. We're dismantling an entire world, and we don't know what we're doing because we don't know what we're undoing. And that, I think, is at the heart of the malaise. And liberalism is exhibit A when it comes to the virus, the sickness. But these people have to be disarmed. We can't take orders from them anymore. They have to be unplugged because their influence has been dreadful.
You know, there's another maxim, too, that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so if we look at what we're undoing and we recognize that the secularist agenda that the progressives are advancing really is not just non-Christian, but anti-Christian, not just post-Christian, but really an attempt to kind of uproot what's left of Christianity, then I think you're going to understand a little better as to why they'll bend over backwards out of fear, but also out of a kind of uncomprehending bewilderment at the face of Islam, knowing that there is nothing they can really do to stop it. But let's just enjoy this because, you know, it makes the Christians, especially the Catholics.
There's a kind of Munich mentality, I think, right, which Churchill was prophetic in exposing. We appease the crocodile because we hope he'll eat us last. And certainly in 1940, Churchill stood alone against the fury of the Third Reich, and in a way, we're standing alone, the church, against the fury of Islam because we're not getting much help from the U.S. government. They're blind. They've forgotten what history can teach.
It is super troubling, and as we look at this horrific tragedy and genocide and attack, it doesn't make any sense. I mean, it defies logic why they aren't sharing this, why this isn't front page news, why we're keeping up with all the different celebrities, and this goes unmentioned. The atrocities against humanity, against Christians, and against the destruction of our historical roots that live there.
Well, if you look at parts of France and even parts of England, Birmingham, where the Muslim communities are really running the show legally and otherwise, where the cops are afraid to go in, and that's certainly communities in France like that. What the Muslims could not do by war, they may, conquering Europe, they may do peacefully by having lots of babies, because as you know, the natural, somebody said to me, well, I'll put some numbers together and said in 50 years from now, if you're an Italian Catholic, you will not have a brother, a sister, a cousin, or uncle, or aunt, because everybody else will be Muslim in the country. So with the negative growth of what we'll call the old Europeans, who aren't having any kids, where abortion is out of control, the Muslims have lots of babies, and they are peacefully becoming the major populations, becoming, you know, significant populations in many of the cities throughout Europe. Now, if they are peace, law-abiding people and accept the basic rules of law and order of that given state, that's fine. But once they become a majority, already they're pushing that Sharia law should become before the civil law. So these are going to become bigger issues as time goes by. So as the appeasement continues, their strength and power grows. And again, once they grow powerfully in the ballot box, they tend to be a liberal if they win elections. So we've seen that in the Middle East. Will we see that in Europe over the next 50 years?
Stay with us for the final segment of Franciscan University Presents.
I'm in the 4+1 program here for counseling. It is very academically challenging, but the classes are a lot of fun. The teachers do love what they teach, and they know their fields very well. If you're interested in mission, that's a big thing here. I did San Diego for 2 years. That was a youth ministry mission. There are a lot of opportunities here to be actively pro-life, praying outside the abortion clinic. There's a big group that goes to the March of Life here from campus. There's just so much you can do as far as faith goes. Franciscan University is academically excellent and passionately Catholic.
Welcome back to Franciscan University Presents. This is our final segment talking about the persecution of Christians in the Middle East. Regis, could you start us off?
Yeah, I've got to begin by thanking you, George, so much for coming and for the work that you've done. As the kids would say, it's inspiring, awesome, absolutely awesome. We gave you that award last night, the Il Poverello Award. I can't think of anyone who deserves it more, and it puts you in some pretty good company.
Yes,
Dorothy
indeed.
Day, Mother Teresa of Calcutta, a saint in heaven. So the road is open for you to pursue that same sanctity. I'm really struck by how bizarre and painfully bewildering circumstances are. I mean, on the one hand, the Obama people are doing nothing, but the people they replaced did the wrong thing. I mean, Eliot in Murder in the Cathedral fingers the last temptation, which is the greatest treason, to do the right thing for the wrong reason. All that neo-conservative nonsense about exporting democracy to these ignorant Islamists, when in fact, democracy is the last thing they needed, because once they got it, they mobilized their masses on behalf of jihad. What they need is Christianity. But how do we export that if we're ashamed of our faith, our heritage? And in the meantime, it's being liquidated by the enemy. You've got your work cut out for you, the church in need. And in a way, the church here is even more acutely in need. It needs nerve, some starch in the shirt, so that it has the moral intelligence to recognize the enemy and the will, the kidney, to summon to fight this enemy. Otherwise, we're going to lose.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Regis. Scott?
Well, I would echo what Regis just said, and thank you for this book. I have been recommending it to everybody. It's a wake-up call for Christians. Generally, Catholics especially, because we've got that 2,000-year-old tradition that is so deeply embedded there in the Middle East. But really, it isn't just the Middle East where Christians are threatened. And so I'm reminded of Proverbs 17, one of my favorite passages at the opening of that chapter, where we read about how a disciplined, diligent slave will rule over an insolent and slothful son. Islam is a religion of divine slavery. That is their own description of it, that the relationship that we have with Allah is a master-slave relation. We have a family bond, a father-son relationship is at the heart of ours. But if the son doesn't outserve the slave from love, then we will be oppressed, as it were. We will be overrun. So this is a wake-up call, not only for long-term study and mobilization, not only for medium-term strategies, but also for short-term survival tactics. And this is where aid to the church in need is so vital, that support we give to them, to you, to give to those, for the cheese-making machines, that kind of thing. I really believe that this is a call to think in terms of the short, the long, and everything in between. For us to wake up and to really take hold of our own faith and to allow Christ through the power of the Spirit to renew the church.
Amen. Thanks. George?
Well, first of all, I've been delighted to be here in Steubenville the last couple of days. I've heard a great deal of it over the years. I know many of your graduates, so I never realized what an incredible institution you have here, from the campus and everything else. So that was a delight, and of course it was a great honor to accept that award last night on behalf of Aid of the Church in Need. What this charity attempts to do, since it was founded in 1948, was to help starving and persecuted Christians, first on the dark side of the Iron Curtain, and since the fall of the Iron Curtain has expanded to throughout the world, and obviously our focus has been on the Middle East. Right now we have to we can argue and argue and argue how we got in this mess, and I agree with you, the neoconservatives, many of whom I've known for years in New York, had this Wilsonian dream of pushing democracy, and it just doesn't necessarily work. But the fact is, because of this mess, we have hundreds of thousands of Christians that are suffering, and our job, first of all, is to pray for them. Your listeners, I would hope, would go out and go to their bishops and say, why aren't we banging the pots and pans? Why aren't we hearing more of this from the pulpit? I had lunch back in May with the Australian ambassador to the Vatican, Ambassador McCarthy, who just stepped down with the change of the government. He was doing this sort of return tour. And he is taking over as chairman of the Aid of the Church in Need operation in Australia. And he suggested to me that, why don't we go back to, if you remember, when we were young, not you, but you and me, when at the end of Mass we had prayers for the conversion of Russia.
Right.
And he said, why don't we bring back an institutional prayer to be said after Mass for the persecuted Christians? I thought it was a great idea. Prayer is the first thing here, but after that we must deal with the practical reality of trying to help starving and suffering people. So, you know, the kind of projects we are funding there, we look at projects, we fund them, we get the money to the Middle East and all the humanitarian aid, because if we as the church don't do it, no one else is going to do it. So where it's a lonely world, and you're right, we have to reinvigorate Catholics here to look at this as the universal church and do what we can in the Middle East. So your listeners out here, when they see the show, hopefully go to our website, take a look at it, but also drop a note in the mail to your bishop saying, why aren't we hearing more about this? Because the institutional church in the United States has to do a lot more, in my judgment.
Yeah, well, thank you, George. If you enjoyed today's program, we have a handout for you from the Age of the Church in Need, the Christian Persecution in the Middle East. This is a great primer. I want to encourage you to both just go to Faith and Reason and download this, or call us up and we'll send you a copy. This is something you should give to your children, your grandchildren, your pastor, your bishop. This is a great 3-4 page summary here of some of the atrocities and the reality of what we're facing in our world today. When I think about the persecution of Christians, the first mind as I was thinking about this topic is the reality of when Paul was persecuting the church. And Saul, Saul, Jesus said to him, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Christ is being persecuted. We have to realize that as the Christians in the Middle East are being persecuted, it is the body of Christ. It is him being tortured. It is him who is suffering. It is him who is being in exile. And they are our brothers and sisters. And we need to, whether it be going on pilgrimage, whether it be in donating to the aid to the church in need, we need to recognize that they are our family. And we have our first priority. If it's not us, as George has said, then who will take care of the church in the Middle East? And we've got to proclaim that truth far and wide. Praying for them is essential, but we need to really go farther than that and say, what are you convicted? It convicts me to say, what am I personally doing, as well as what we as a university can do to help the church suffering, the church persecuted in the Middle East. Thank you for watching this program. I want to invite you to be a part of our mission here at Franciscan University. We believe we're called to educate, evangelize, and send forth joyful disciples. I want to invite you to come and possibly get your degree here at Franciscan University or through our online programs. Maybe join us for one of our dynamic summer conferences, or join with us as we travel around to the holy shrines through our pilgrimage office to the Holy Land and many other sites. Or to go to faithandreason.com to be equipped for the new evangelization with videos, talks, downloads from some of the great intellectual and spiritual leaders of our time. Until next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you.
To download the free handout on today's topic, go to faithandreason.com. Email your request for the handout to presents@franciscan.edu. At faithandreason.com, you can also purchase past episodes of Franciscan University Presents, or request today's free handout and purchase past programs by calling 888-333-0381. That's 888-333-0381, or call 740-283-6357.